Good morning, and welcome to the third session of the birth narratives, and we're still in Matthew. Here we are. Now, I want to let you know what I've done for the last couple of days. For the last few days, what I've tried to do is bring you into what Matthew's world would have looked like through his eyes. That is, his theological system, his social system. Okay, that's one thing I've tried to do. Second thing I've tried to do is I've tried to throw some little monkey wrenches in there relating to the whole question of the virgin birth. What I'm trying to do, in a sense, is create a great disconnect for you when it comes to these texts, because it's so easy just to read these texts and go, oh, I know what they're saying, and I can either accept or reject them. It's just that's the simple way to deal with these texts. And by simple, I really do mean that in kind of almost a pejorative sense. To either say, I know what these texts are saying, bang, you're done, or I know what these texts are saying, I reject it, bang, you're done. Either way, there's a presumption here. And so for the last 2 days, 2 sessions, what I've been trying to do is bring you into Matthew's worldview, and also to help you begin to develop the model that I use with regard to early Christianity. And that model is that, in a sense, there's a dividing line within apostolic Christianity. And that dividing line is clearly presented at Antioch. That dividing line, you can see the trajectory and the influence of that dividing line through all the so-called apostolic documents in the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament. I'm going to be working on that again today, because what I want to help you see is that Matthew's birth story and the interest of Jewish Christianity in the birth narrative, and it's Jewish Christianity, it's that Jerusalem-oriented Christianity that's very focused on Jesus' birth narrative. There's a because of the way that Judaism worked, and because of Jesus' mamzer status during his lifetime, there is going to be within Jewish Christianity a great, let's just call it urge, perhaps might be a term we could use, to show the legitimacy of Jesus on all levels. Son of David, son of Abraham. Of course, we've already seen this in the title here of Matthew's Gospel, but also Son of God, Son of the Father. And again, it's important to note, Joseph is never called Jesus Pater or Abba. Only God is. Now, I said to you in the last couple of days, it doesn't matter whether you believe there's a real virgin birth or not. The reason I said that is because I want to create a little breathing room for those of you that come to a text like this, and because it is supernatural. That's very bad language to use, but it's the language the church uses, the general Christian uses, so we're going to use that. We have an integral worldview here, but we need to use that language. And so some people come to this text, they go, oh, no way, we know these things don't happen, bang, I can't pay any attention to it. And they're going to really miss what's happening here. Absolutely miss what's happening here. First of all, when you ask, why would a Jew be interested in making sure that this Jesus of Nazareth had a legitimate tie back into the narrative history of Israel? Why is that necessary? And why is it necessary to further then be able to tie that figure Jesus into the Son of God? And that's precisely what Matthew does here in this birth narrative, because not only is he going to be bringing Abraham and Abrahamic type dream stories into the Joseph narrative, and he does. He's not only bringing David into this, and we saw that with the play on the 3 times 14 generations DVD there in Hebrew. We saw the double mention of David, of course, before and after the genealogy to highlight that. But there's a third figure that's going to be coming on the scene here in chapter 2, and that's Moses. And of course, when you read chapter 2, and of course you have the whole persecution of the infant Jesus, just like you did the infant Moses. You have the flight from Egypt and the flight to Egypt. There's a number of things here that evoke the Moses story, particularly when you remember. Now, this is very, very, very important to remember, okay? You have to keep this in your head. In Second Temple Judaism, yes, there's the Hebrew text. Most people don't speak or read Hebrew. The general population will speak Aramaic, the Jewish population, particularly in Galilee, and again, dialects, different dialects of Aramaic are present in Jesus' Palestine, and Greek. It's more than likely probable that Jesus spoke rudimentary Greek, and some scholars need to just kind of get over that. And it's also possible, that Jesus may have learned how to speak Hebrew, although I'm not certain. And I'm fairly certain that he would have learned to read the way readers learn to read text. Even if they didn't understand them, they could pronounce them. But he may not have learned to read for comprehension. Reading and writing are two very different skills in the ancient world. And I think right now the balance shifts in terms of perceiving Jesus as illiterate, although not unlearned, and that's very important. And also remember how much orality played within the life and the memory of the teaching of the sages. So we keep all this in mind. Then we come to Matthew, of course, who is a reader and a writer in the ancient world, a Jewish scribe who knows all of these stories, but not just simply as the text tells them, but elaborated upon. And so we saw yesterday, for example, or the session before, I read to you the elaboration of the birth of Noah from the book of Enoch, from book 5, in the last section of the Apocalypse of Weeks. And we saw that expanded. We see all kinds of narrative expanded in all manner of ways within Judaism. That is, when Jews read these texts, they didn't leave them alone. They explored them, they explained them, and it's not willy-nilly. This is thought out. Okay, this is the educated doing this, and we see this in the Targums. We see it in the rabbinic midrash. We see it in the kind of Pesher commentary that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see it in the apocalyptic literature, like First Enoch. I mean, this kind of retelling the story and elaborating upon it is very, very Jewish. It's very Jewish. So, whether or not and how much actual tradition the writer of Matthew has at his disposal in the birth narrative is in a sense inconsequential, and it's a false approach to history. It's like saying that, well, we have to have it this way in order for it to be true. All history is constructed. It's all reconstructed and reconstructed again. It's always being told over and over again because history is a lie. We know this from mimetic theory. We mythologize our victims. History is a lie. And as the gospel penetrates history, it creates a break in there so that it forces history to be retold. And that's the power of the gospel post-Holocaust right now in our world today. It's forcing the way we have told our history open. It's inviting us to think of the third way of perceiving history. But right now we are in this time of travail. That's the power of the gospel. And that's when Matthew, as a Jew, may be taking, segments of tradition, and how much, you can read your scholars on this. You can go to your commentators have, these verses are from the tradition and they're minimal, or some say, no, they're maximal. And some say, the writer has inherited 118 to 223. And he's just added the formula quotations, the last redactor, the final redactor. Who knows? it doesn't really matter in one sense, okay? Unless you're trying to reconstruct early Christian history, it really doesn't matter. From the perspective of the writer, writing in and around Antioch in the 80s, late 70s or 80s, it would be probably the 80s, because he certainly has a copy of the Markan text in front of him, and it certainly would have needed to have been discussed for some time prior to the actual making of the Gospel of Matthew, I would expect. So let's say the late 70s, perhaps, or even up to 80, when this Gospel's being written in Antioch, remembering that a generation later, okay, Ignatius is a Gentile bishop there in Antioch. Can we draw a line, a conclusion from Galatians chapter 2 and Paul's issue of the table in Antioch to Matthew's gospel and the question of the inclusion of Gentiles at the Eucharistic table to Ignatius? Now, the reason I asked that question is I was reflecting this morning upon this problem, and it occurred to me that one of the things that we do is we appeal to Ignatius for what's known as the monarchical bishopric, which means one bishop over a territory, a region, an area, and everyone is in line with the bishop. And Ignatius really works on this big time, but everybody being in line with the bishop. Now, because Ignatius is dealing with several fronts. One is an incipient Gnosticism, and perhaps an early form of some sort of Marcionism, although I'm not sure or certain that's there. But Ignatius does deal with the problem of Judaism. And I wonder, even at that late date, were the Jewish Christians still, some of these communities, these house church communities, were they still refusing to eat together with the Gentiles? Was that why Ignatius says we need to be in harmony on this? There needs to be one table. When you go look at Jewish Christian literature after this time, you can find it in what scholars reconstruct as a document known as the Kerygmata Petru, in the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies and Recognitions, as a great gold mine right there. It can be found in other texts, the Gospel of the Nazarenes and the perhaps reconstructed Gospel of the Hebrews, or what's left of it, these kinds of things. And you'll find that there is this virulent hatred of Paul. I mean, Paul is the bad guy. He's the Antichrist in Jewish Christianity. So one wonders about that trajectory, and if Matthew is still in that is the Matthian community a community that's truly open to Gentiles? That's the big question. Or is this community only open to Gentiles as long as they become circumcised, keep the Sabbath, and keep a kosher table? The issues at Antioch and the issues that plagued Paul. These are important issues to Pharisees, to Essenes, to Sadducees, to Samaritans, and to Zealots, hyper holiness code people, right, that are militant about it. They were all important to the pre-converted Saul. So as you read Matthew's gospel now, if you keep this possibility in mind, and you keep the further remembrance, as Overman and others, Balch and others have observed, that this gospel is being written at a time where Judaism is being reconceived under the great leadership of Johann ben Zakkai and other proto-rabbis, early rabbis, however you want to make that distinction, in Yavne and elsewhere. There is going to be the question of who are the true heirs of Judaism now that the temple's fallen. now that there is no temple, no, even if there's minimal evidence, as Victor Epstein pointed out in an essay long ago, of sacrifice continuing on up until the Bar Kokhba revolution in the 130s. Nevertheless, Judaism is having to reconfigure itself, and who becomes the true heirs of this particular tradition? I mean, the Essenes got wiped out. The Sadducees, the Zadokites, the wealthy, got wiped out. That left certain Pharisaic groups, certain Samaritan groups. The Zealots got wiped out. And if you follow the work of Philip Seigel, as I do, certain proto-rabbinic or sage groups. Matthew's community is having to say, who is this Jesus that was part of this history of Israel? And in fact, he is the Messiah. If in fact he is the son of David, if in fact he is the son of Abraham, then everything changes for the history of Israel. Everything. There's a culmination of something happening. And that's the whole point of the birth narrative here. Again, it is essential to keep in mind that in this birth narrative, as in Luke's, we are looking at a salvific God, a God who does not come rapaciously, or at least with violence, a God who can be contrasted to the current king of empire here, Herod. Luke's concern is the larger Roman Empire. Matthew's is just Israel. That's his orientation here. And so when we read this text, we should not be surprised at what's coming, because what's going to be coming in this text is this Mosaic now figure who will redeem his people, just as Moses did. Are you with me on this? And that's why it's necessary in chapter 2 to have this Herod Jesus, Pharaoh, baby Moses parallelism. We go right from Joseph being a righteous man who does the right thing by Mary and carries on, and in fact he's the one that gets the honor of naming Jesus, Yeshua. The whole second narrative then is going to be in and around the crisis this birth causes the human species, and it is a crisis, and it still is. One of the things about preaching this particular Matthean narrative, if you're a preacher, is to underscore that the birth of Jesus into the world creates a crisis for the world. Okay? Now, when you're being oppressed by the world, you can go, yay, the rich are going to get it, on and on and on. But when you realize, as did Paul and other New Testament writers, that everybody's in the same boat here, that it's the world that needs redemption, then you can begin to see that this salvation perspective that Matthew has, it's essential that he ties it back into Israelite history. It is frustrating that history is in a sense overlain by the Hanukkah worldview. The worldview of this kind of apocalyptic dualism, where there's a good God and an evil Satan, and you have a world full of angels and demons. I want to just give you a little flavor. It's book 5. Again, if you can go online and read First Enoch, it's a rather remarkable collection to begin with. The Book of the Watchers is in itself amazing. The parables it's a remarkable section. But for our interests right now, it's book 5, the 2 ways of the righteous and a sinner in the apocalypse of weeks. Boy, first of all, we're going to be familiar with this kind of writing right from the book of Revelation. If you've read Revelation, studied Revelation, been in any crazy dispensationalist approach to Revelation, you're going to see all kinds of stuff from Revelation out of First Enoch. It's the same worldview. The only difference is the rider on the white horse has a name, Jesus. And even if, as the Mennonite scholars have argued, he's coming back nonviolently, the text itself is still rather stunning in its double resurrection, one to life, one to death, and these sorts of things. It's as though it does not break free from that Second Temple understanding of judgment. So I do want to read to you something about what happens to the sinners that are dead. But as I was reading this this last few days, I mean, it really struck me, and it should strike you too. You know this litany or liturgy. It is a litany. It's an amazing text, and let me just read it to you and just ask yourself, where do you hear this today? Are you ready? This is from chapter 103, First Enoch, beginning in verse 5. He's talking about, what happens to the righteous after death and what happens to sinners after death. Woe unto you sinners who are dead, when you are dead in the wealth of your sins, because they've been excoriated for being wealthy in life and having a good time, oppressing. When you are dead in the wealth of your sins, those who are like you will say to you, happy are you sinners. The sinners have seen all their days. They have died now in prosperity and wealth. They have not experienced struggle and battle in their lifetime. They have died in glory, and there was no judgment in their lifetime. You yourselves know that they will bring your souls down to Sheol, and they shall experience evil and great tribulation in darkness, nets, and burning flame. Your soul shall enter into the great judgment. It shall be a great judgment in all the generations of the world. Woe unto you, for there is no peace for you. Now to the righteous and kind ones during their lifetime, do not say, in our days of toil we have surely suffered hardships and have experienced every trouble. We have faced many evil things and have become consumed. We have died and become few by the littleness of our spirit. We have been destroyed, and we have found none whatsoever to help us with a word or otherwise. We have been tortured and destroyed and could not even hope to see life from one day to the next. We had hoped to be the head and have become the tail. We have moiled as we toiled, but had no authority over our own toil. We have become the victuals of the sinners and the oppressors. They have made their yoke heavy upon us. Those who hate us while goading us and encompassing us have become masters over us. We have bowed our necks to those who hate us, but they had no pity on us. We wanted to get away from them in order that we may escape and be at rest, but found no place to which we might flee and be safe from them. Then in our tribulation, we brought a charge against them before the authorities and cried out against those who were devouring us. But the authorities neither would pay attention to our cries nor wished to listen to our voice. But on the contrary, they were assisting those who were robbing and devouring us, those who were causing us to diminish. The authorities conceal the offenders in justice and do not remove the yokes of those who devour us, scatter us, and murder us. The authorities cover up our murder, and the authorities do not remember the fact that the offenders have lifted up their hands against us. I swear unto you that in heaven the angels will remember you for good before the glory of the Great One, and your name shall be written before the glory of the Great One. Be hopeful, because formerly you have pined away through evil and toil. But now you shall shine like the lights of heaven, and you shall be seen, and the windows of heaven shall be opened for you. Your cry shall be heard. Cry for judgment, and it shall appear for you. For all your tribulations shall be demanded for investigation from the responsible authorities, from everyone who assisted those who plunder you. Be hopeful and do not abandon your hope. There shall be a fire. And it goes right on to say, eternal judgment shall be far away from you, but shall be for the sinners. It sounds kind of like the current lament of our progressive left here in America, doesn't it? Including the Christians. Again, the blood of Abel. This is the blood of Abel, people. That's all this is the blood of Abel. That Second Temple Judaism is the blood of Abel. Christianity never got out of that. I can tell you in a nutshell how it happened. Jesus' ethics, his nonviolent ethic, it becomes the core of the Christian tradition right away, immediately, this approach. And it's reflected in the Didache. It's an early oral tradition. It's picked up in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. You can see it in the writings of Paul. You see it in the Epistle of James. You see it even in 1 Peter. You see it in Matthew. You see it in the Revelation. This nonviolent ethic, it permeates Christian ethos. One part of Christianity did not take that ethic and ask about its theological implications. The other part did. And that's the part we follow. That's the gospel. That's a nutshell. So you have this amazing text here. And what is it that gets heard is the cry for judgment. Well, that's what we see in Matthew's gospel, don't we? That's the eschatology of Matthew's gospel. You go to chapters 24 and 25. You go read any of the texts that the great Matthean texts that have to do with judgment, and they fall precisely in line with this, just as the Revelator does. The John the Revelator does in his Apocalypse, just as the little Epistle of Jude does. First Peter wants to kind of even riff on this and talk about, either Jesus as an Enoch model or Enoch. He refers either the Greek phrase en hokai is either by whom also, in whom also, or is one word Enoch, in 1 Peter 3. And there's good debates around that. You can have some fun there. The point is that even Peter develops this nonviolent ethic and starts to kind of take it down into this sphere of the dead thing, into Sheol. Why? Because good and bad both go to Sheol in the Hanukkah, in the apocalyptic worldview. When you die, everybody goes to Sheol. It's just some get redeemed from Sheol and become shining lights in the heavens, and the others, Sheol turns into this mass inferno. Keep that in mind as you read this, because what do you have here? Herod slaughtering people here on earth is fundamentally no different than a God who slaughters people at the end of time, but Matthew hasn't worked that out yet in his eschatology. There's still the category of justice to be preserved, and that's why one of the key Matthean words is dikaiosune, righteousness. Seek first the reign of God and his righteousness. Matthew has to add that. Matthew has to say, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. It's a key term for Matthew, this dikaiosune, this justice. It's a key term for Paul in his debate with them. And Matthew's dikaiosune has an economy of exchange that comes from Second Temple Jewish eschatology. Paul's doesn't. For Matthew, the apocalyptic day is yet to come. For Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel, the apocalyptic day was the day Christ died. That was the day that changed everything. You have two different understandings. The apocalyptic is still in the future, or the apocalyptic has happened. That's the apostolic viewpoint. It's already occurred. The turning of the ages has happened. Jewish Christianity hasn't quite caught up to that yet, because there's still, again, caught up in the larger question of dikaiosune, as justice. That's what they're caught up with. They want justice, just as the sinners in First Enoch want justice, just as our progressives today want justice. Okay? Justice is just the liberal way of the conservative use of the term holiness. They both are oriented toward zeal. And this is the problem. Now, if you want, let's just say that keeping this in mind, it is intriguing, is it not, that Matthew's openness to a Gentile mission, which we know from chapter 28, when you go to the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, you have what is known as the Great Commission. And the writer there says, go into all the nations. You also have the introduction of Magi in chapter 2. And again, I want to recall for you Amy Richter's important observations here. Just as you have the introduction of the Magi, so you have the introduction of the 4 women in the genealogy who use illicit, that is according to this Second Temple worldview, who use illicit arts that are taught by demons in order to seduce or be seduced by, or have some kind of sexual infelicity, as it were, with these male figures in their stories. They become part of this genealogy. So in the introduction of the Magi as well. Again, Amy Richter's argument is that this is done especially to help us understand that there is a redemption occurring within this Henochic worldview. That is, there's a reversal of this theodicy. That's what's happening here. By the way, you can take this reversal of this Henochic theodicy, and you can, in a sense, take it all the way up to Irenaeus and his view of recapitulation, or apodikatastasis. It's the same thing. It's the redemption of this Henochic worldview. But this Henochic worldview, if it is, again, laden with issues because of its economies of exchange, if there is another worldview, and that is, of course, the worldview of the gospel, what we are wanting to do is to read Matthew here in his own context, dealing with his own issues, and recognize, like Paul would, like the author of the 4th Gospel would, there are places that this text is still going to be sacrificial. It's inevitable. And so we will see throughout Matthew's Gospel a real struggle between this pacifist ethic of the life of Jesus and still this Second Temple retributive eschatology. And the two are there. Just as you can find them in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul is still in that model. You can see that. And it's a significant change between the Thessalonian letters of 41 and the letter to the Ephesians, or the Laodiceans, as Doug Campbell would say, in, say, 50. Big change. Okay, so having noticed this, now I want to come back to the question of the virgin birth. Remember, I brought up to you Bonhoeffer's beef with Barth. And I said, for Bonhoeffer, as a good liberal, having to be able to say, yes, there was this historical virgin birth seemed rather absurd to him. And so we want to ask the question, let's delve into this a bit. Why would the virgin birth be important to Matthew's community? Well, I've already stated a few reasons. One is to correct impressions about Jesus' manager status. Okay, there certainly would have been rumors, they were floating around in Jesus' lifetime about his manager status, and they could have become kind of stock in change rebuttals from within Judaism. They're certainly used by Celsus in the 2nd century. So, you have that. You have, excuse me, throat's dry. I'm going to take a drink. Give me 1 second. You have the larger question of the Matthean sociology and who's the true heir to Judaism. You have the, perhaps, we'll just use the potential frame of issues related to Antioch, Matthew, Ignatius, and the common table, the question of whether Gentiles and Jews could eat together. Each of these is part of this. And then again, this writer's desire to show that within this worldview, the Second Temple worldview, there is a redemption. There is a redemption in Jesus, that something has happened in Jesus. And what is it? Well, again, it centers around his life. It centers around his ministry, doesn't it? Because we've already noted Kingsbury's possible structure, that at 4:17 and at 16:21, where it says, and from this time Jesus began to teach, that there's an introduction there to a new section. And we've also observed that there are 5 major discourses in this gospel. There's the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, the missionary discourse of chapter 10, parables of 13, the church discourse of 18, and the eschatological discourse of chapter 24 and 25. There's these 5 major discourses. And some, Bacon and others, are suggesting that what you have in Matthew's gospel is kind of like 5 books of the Torah, that Jesus is bringing the new law. Anabaptists certainly wanted to read the Sermon on the Mount that way, as the new law. And that is, it's frustrating at this point, because one could certainly want to see that Mosaic pattern there, but I'm uncertain that it's actually there. Although Jesus is compared to Moses here, there is an authority in his teaching, and we can see this especially in the antitheses. You have heard it said, but I say to you. There is a shift. There is something that's happening here in Matthew's gospel. Jesus will be better than Solomon, better than Jonah. There's these things that are occurring that are better than that are reprising this history of Israel in this one figure, Jesus of Nazareth. Again, keep this in mind, because next time we talk, I want to do a little work with you in the Sermon on the Mount and the Didache, and talk about this ethical, nonviolent construct that permeates the early church, and how it's not able to break through the theology of the Jewish Christian tradition, while it does break through in Paul. But because the early church put the whole thing together in one canon, 27 books, the New Testament, the assumption is it's all saying the same thing. And what happens is now Paul and the rest of the New Testament writers get read through this Matthean Revelation, Jude, 1st, 2nd Peter construct, rather than seeing it as 2 trajectories, religion and revelation. See what I'm saying? And that's what we want to do as we continue working through this. But let's note again, this Enochic martyrology, as it were, we see in the book of the Revelation. You see it in the book of Daniel with the 3 figures in the fiery furnace. Apocalyptic is martyr literature, okay? Martyr literature resonates with apocalyptic because martyr literature is the martyrdom of the righteous. And there needs to be justice and balance and equity in this apocalyptic literature. It's to be expected. It's just the blood of Abel transferred into a judgment scene worldview. That's all this is. An entirely different judgment scene worldview is given to you in Paul and the writer of John, who says judgment's on the cross. I mean, so much so that Paul can say there is no judgment. It's God reconciling God's self. And the Johannine writer can say, this is the judgment of the world right here. He calls the cross the day of judgment. End of story. And it was. It was our day of judgment. We judged wrong, big time wrong. And we were judged wrong on that day. That's the power of the gospel. It's frustrating then, isn't it, to go to this Gospel of Matthew and recognize that for all of its beauty, and we're used to its beauty and its structure and its great thinking. I mean, it's just amazing thinking that goes on in this text, that we're nevertheless still left in the long run with a Jesus who's started to become assimilated to this worldview. That is, you see in the Gospel of Matthew, as it were, a certain subtle shifting of bringing Jesus in line with this Second Temple Jewish eschatology. Again, not something that Paul or the writer of the fourth gospel would do. It's certainly questionable whether Jesus himself would do such a thing. I don't think so. In fact, I see him, the historical Jesus, actually battling that same battle. But for Matthew's community, it's understandable that we have a need for judgment and justice. Remember, this large Jewish community has just lost its temple that has been standing for 500-600 years since the exiles came back. It's gone. They're broken. They're decimated. And how do you say to the Jewish community at that point, God is with us? How do you do that? Well, the way Matthew does it, again, frustratingly, is to say, look, God came. Here was God. You did this to him. He already told you that these were going to be the consequences, the destruction of the temple. So now follow him. That's kind of how the logic of Matthew works out here with regard to a mission to local Jews. And then as well, full of the kind of apologetic motifs, like I said, the use of the fulfillment quotations, which Davies and Allison want to argue are put in by the final redactor of the text, and that's fine. I'm not so interested. I do get interested in breaking a text down for them critically and a tradition, and looking at the tradition history arguments, and these things I like. I really, really do like. But you need to know that in the long run, all scholars are doing is making judgments based upon how they evaluate pieces of evidence and whether parallels, so-called parallels, are really parallels or not, this and that and the other. And we all make these judgments. All scholars do when they're engaging in this type of reading of the text. And then there are other hermeneutic approaches that we've applied as well. And again, knowing that when you read a text, you're wanting to read it from as many directions as you can. As you in this sense, I apply a cartload of different hermeneutics every time I read any given text. I'm looking, at it from form critically, redaction critically, in terms of the development of the potential oral tradition, its relationship to other texts, or its relationship to other traditions. Of course, the question of dating of those traditions in relation to a particular gospel text, all these things come into play, yada, yada, yada. Whether you value a tradition as early or late, like the Gospel of Thomas, a lot of scholars want to date it early. I still date it late. These kinds of things. You make up your mind on these kinds of issues, and you say, okay, this could have come here, this makes sense to come there, and dot, 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 dot. And so you've got your oral tradition as you're developing, and I carry all that with me as I come into this reading of this text, and I know you don't yet, and I'm just trying to show you where some of these things come from that I'm talking about. But again, what are we dealing with? We go right from, this is the book of the Genesis, the beginning of Jesus, son of David, king, and bam, there's a clash with another king, and bam, there's violence. Right there. And it's out in the open. This king fears this baby as a potential usurper, and will scapegoat an entire group of children, figuring from the time the Magi left where they left, 2 years and under, bam, kill them all. Again, is the narrative historical? It doesn't matter. It's typical of Herod. It's certainly typical of rulers in general. For whom it's better that one die or a group die than that the group or the nation perish. This is the scapegoat mechanism being revealed right here in this birth narrative of Matthew. Already, it begins in violence, just as Mark's opens up with all these conflict stories, okay? Now, Luke's going to open a little differently, and I'm going to raise some big questions about the way Luke does certain things. Good questions. I think Luke is very clever. If we ever get to Luke. But I want you to look at this text now and begin to see this. Now, again, remember, chapters 1 and 2 and chapters 3 and 4 up to verse 16 are the first major section. So don't forget the birth story segue right into the John the Baptist narrative of chapter 3 and 4. And all Luke's going to do is take that and create this whole backstory about John the Baptist's birth. But to connect, you have to connect the birth of Jesus and John the Baptist. This is done in both the Matthean and the Lucan narratives. You have to do that. In fact, it's essential to make that connection. Why? Look at John the Baptist preaching. It's Second Temple preaching, isn't it? Day of recompense and judgment, as the Samaritans would say. Isn't it? You get that feel from John the Baptist, don't you? It's there. You still have sacred violence there. You have something else too. That's why Jesus says, there's nobody been born of a woman greater than John the Baptist. I mean, that's significant. Jesus can say that because John is, even as he's still the last of this great line of prophets in Israel's history, he's still not yet in the kingdom, in the reign of God, where this nonviolent ethic is translated into a worldview and eliminated the need for a Second Temple worldview, and thus also eliminated any need for the redemption model that's deployed within that Second Temple worldview. Okay? Well, I'll leave that here for today. We're at 46 minutes. I hope you enjoyed your time, and I will keep reading. I'm enjoying doing this every day. I'm just plowing ahead little bits each day, so you might just get me every day for a while. And I hope as you go to celebrate this Christmas tide in a month, as we walk through Advent together, you'll have some new appreciation for the biblical writers, the stories they tell, the importance of the birth of Jesus in certain traditions and why it's important in those traditions, and perhaps also to understand why it's not necessarily so important in others. And we'll continue to look at these texts together. So I know some of you just joined. Hi, Matthew. I'm actually getting ready to leave and sign off, brother. You'll have to go back and listen to this. Peace and love to you. Happy Thanksgiving. I'm looking forward. I've already got my sweet potatoes in the oven, and I got stuffing to make today, and I'll make my pies today, and then I'll be cooking all day tomorrow. But there's a chance, just because I'm having such a good time teaching here, that I might even jump on tomorrow and plow through some more of Matthew and reading Matthew's birth narrative in light of his gospel. And then we'll eventually get to Luke, and we'll work through that. So thank you, Nate. Happy Thanksgiving to all the Americans out there. I'm thankful for you. Thanks for your support. Thank you very much. We've gone from $1,630 last month to about $2,300 right now. I do need to get it to $4,000 by the end of this month, before December 1st. And I'm hoping that you'll all be able to say that you enjoy this kind of teaching. And I'm willing to do it all the time. You see, I got a lot to share and a lot to teach. And I hope you'll all have fun with me as we continue through the birth narratives. And then we're going to work through the book I want to write about all of this. So peace and love. Cheers. All the best. And good day.